On this episode of China Unscripted, Europe is making a deal with the CCP, but it's straining its alliance with the US. What will 2021 have in store? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And so, this is a great story. In the same year, the Chinese Communist Party caused a global pandemic by covering up the coronavirus. In the same year, the Chinese Communist Party completely violated an international agreement and completely crushed Hong Kong. And in the same year, it's really come out that they're using ethnic slave labor. The EU decided it was time to make an international agreement with the Chinese Communist Party.
An investment deal.
And a big investment deal.
You forgot to mention that it's also in the same year that the CCP screwed over Australia despite having a supposedly free trade agreement. So there's also that. But again, hindsight is 2020.
Well, so the reason Matt brings that up is because China and Australia have a trade deal where, free trade. But China has been putting tariffs and essentially banning imports.
Right.
It's not a problem.
They
They're
can't put
free.
tariffs because it's a free trade.
Mm-hmm.
So what they did instead of tariffs is they just blocked the imports of Australian coal and timber and, worst of all, of course, lobsters.
I found out that Australian rock lobsters don't have claws.
What do they have?
They just
Guns?
Mittens.
don't have. They just don't have big front claws.
Really?
Yeah, I saw a photo of them and I was like, "Oh, those look different than I realized."
What pathetic
And you realized it
lobsters.
wasn't a rock. It was a rock lobster.
I'm sorry to our audio person for.
I'm sorry to the audience. We'll
All right.
just cut that.
Anyway, so very few people will get that reference.
That was a reference?
Oh, you didn't know about that? I would think that you would know about.
B-52 is like obscure band from the 70s. Yeah, no, obviously.
no.
That's too obscure for you.
Yeah.
Wow, you
likes
don't-
Fortress Macross.
B-52s is not an obscure band.
I mean, I heard of them, but they kind of sucked.
You have now just offended 1% of our audience.
Well,
Oh.
anyways.
Anyway, but yeah, there's a song called Rock Lobster.
Okay. Well, all right. All right. No more obscure references. So-
Wait, is this a one-way street? Like you just don't want them from me?
It's like a China deal.
Okay.
Well, so
that
anyways-
sounds great. I'd love that deal, Chris.
Well, so anyways, when I heard about this this deal Europe was making, my first reaction was, have you guys seen Evangelion?
Okay,
That's kind of an obscure reference, Chris.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah. Well, anyways, there's this one character, Asuka, who looks down at the other characters, just like, here, I'll just film it on my phone. We'll add that in. This is going to be good. This was my reaction to the Australia deal. Pathetic. There we go. But yes, it is absolutely pathetic. So what is in this deal?
Well, it's a historic deal.
It's
Because-
a historic deal.
According to the European Commission, it's the most ambitious agreement that China has ever concluded with a third country, which is a little confusing.
Who's the second country?
Yeah, but
And what about
Like,
the WTO or the U.S. Free Trade
This
Agreement or
is
the
already
Australia?
not looking good.
No.
But go on.
I think it's possible that it refers
Go
to
on.
some term that we're just not familiar with. But anyway, according to the European Commission, this deal will require the Chinese Communist Party to deliver on obligations for the behavior of state-owned enterprises, comprehensive transparency rules for subsidies, and commitments related to sustainable development.
Oh, so the Chinese Communist Party is promising to be transparent and open.
Yes.
That's
and,
always-
sustainable.
That's always worked. Well, the big win
Well,
for...
it is more sustainable once they get money from Europe.
Well, that is the big thing. China really has been hit economically very hard over the past several years with the trade deal, the trade war with the U.S., also things like the coronavirus. So this is actually what what was his name? Li Dongshen?
Di Dongshen.
Di Dongshen.
Yeah,
that's
it is exactly what he's talking about. Do you want to
For
explain
our
it?
audience,
or-
who's Di Dongshen and what is he talking about?
Okay, so you might have seen that clip of this Chinese professor talking about the Biden administration and how Wall Street wasn't able to basically get the Trump administration to do what China wanted them to do, even though Wall Street are old friends of China, basically. And then he was saying that, oh, well, when the Biden administration comes in, it'll be different because Biden's son has business deals with China. Everybody laughs,
Get
hilarious.
it?
Yeah. But the full speech that he did that most people haven't seen, he's mostly talking about how China should decouple with the U.S. And how it's better economically for China to decouple with the U.S. But then he's pointing out, so if we decouple from the U.S., why are we encouraging them to, invest in China? Why are we encouraging foreign businesses to come in if we want to decouple with them? And he's saying, well, the key is as long as we're dependent on the U.S. dollar, as long as we use the US dollar, as long as we are investing in the US stock market, it means the US gets to call the shots. So if we get to get the US and other foreign companies to come in, then we get to call the shots, right? If they're on our turf, if they're using the yuan, if they're investing in our companies, then we can be the one to, set the rules. And, the US can't sanction us anymore. It won't matter.
And this is exactly what this deal was about. So on the surface, it seems like, hey, this is a good deal for Europe. It's going to loosen many of the restrictions on European companies in China, including the requirement that they operate through joint ventures with Chinese partners and share sensitive technology. We'll see whether or not that actually happens. But
yeah, it's supposed to guarantee that there's no more forced technology transfer.
That's right.
Well, what's interesting about that is like, for Europe, they're like, oh, great. No longer do we have to do joint ventures. No longer do we have to forcibly share our technology. But that should have never been a thing that they agreed to in the first place, right? It's like basically the CCP is saying all these things that we forced you to do that we really had no right to do under the WTO rules. We're going to now back off from that.
Aren't we so generous?
Exactly. And that's enough. You know what I mean? But and also... I'm unclear from the way it's written so far because the whole thing is not completely written out, but it seems like certain things may only apply to state-owned enterprises.
There are some specific things that apply to state-owned enterprises, but I think forced technology transfer rules limiting that and the joint venture apply to all companies. There is also, Chris, to your point, a specific part about financial services industries, Wall Street or the, city of, the European equivalent of these, big investment firms, that they'll be allowed to, come in without having to do joint venture requirements for banking or securities trading or insurance or asset management, all of these things that these financial companies had wanted for many years to be able to come in and, you get into the China market. And so, there's a commitment in this to keep opening that market to EU investors.
Right. Well, I think the timing of this deal is very interesting for a number of reasons. They've been trying to negotiate it for 7 years, basically stalled up until very recently. European officials are saying that the breakthrough came in December when China said they would agree to stronger commitments to observe standards on forced labor and climate change.
They didn't really agree to observe stronger commitments, though.
Yeah, well, specifically, it was China has agreed to, quote, make continued and sustained efforts, end quote, to ratify international conventions on banning forced labor. And this is that is not a promise to do it. It's not there are no consequences if they don't. There are no inspections. This is a deal where Europe has very knowingly sold out human rights, any kind of international transparency, just for the sake of essentially Europe's financial deep state.
Well, I mean, they promised to make sustained efforts.
Continued
effort. But also significant about the timing, we were talking about this earlier, is this was something pushed forward by Angela Merkel, primarily for the benefit of German car makers. But there's going to be a bit of a shakeup in the EU power structure, correct?
Yeah. Well, the presidency of the Council of the European Union changes to a new country every 6 months. So for Germany, it was July through December 2020. And so now that it's January 2021, it's a new country, right? And so Germany wanted to push it through by the end of December, which they did. By it, I mean the initial agreement for it, right?
It still needs to be ratified.
Right, but Angela Merkel wants credit. And also, she supposedly is going to leave her post by the end of 2021. She's been German chancellor since 2005 or something.
Mhm.
Like a really, really long time.
And in that
And-
time, very pro-China, opened up Germany to a lot of Chinese investment.
Right. So she says she's going to not run for another term after the elections in Germany this year, which may or may not be true because, sometimes politicians don't tell the whole truth. But let's assume that's true. She wants to push through something. Like I read something about how she wants this to be one of her legacies, like securing a China deal.
Oh, it will be part of her legacy.
Yes.
Oh, well, so just to go back to it, like the ratification part of this agreement will basically take a little over a year, by which point the presidency will have passed to. Next is Portugal, and then it goes to France.
Then it goes to Slovenia, and then France will
Ah.
be January through the end of June 2022.
which is when this would be ratified. I believe.
Maybe.
Well, maybe.
Yeah,
It
maybe.
depends on how things go. But then interesting, after that, it goes to the Czech Republic or Czechia. I don't know which one they use.
It's let's just call it the Czech Republic.
the Czech
please.
Republic.
Thank you.
And they have a very different kind of stance towards China than a lot of the...
Not all of the Czech Republic. I think
Prague.
actually the president of the Czech Republic is pretty pro-China.
But the
Mm,
mayor of Prague is
Very pro-Taiwan.
very awesome.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But one more thing about the timing of all this is that it happens before a Biden administration would begin. And actually, apparently, the Biden administration tried to encourage Europe not to sign it, that they wanted to wait until after Biden assumed power.
Right, because Biden has been talking about working with our European allies to counter China. I kind of feel like our European allies just poked us in the eye.
Oh, that's a good point.
Was that I didn't get the reference.
Oh, Biden was like, the problem with Trump is he's
Uh,
gone poking in everyone's eye.
Okay, you got to work on the Biden impression, I think.
Oh,
Come
gosh.
on, man.
Come on, man. That's good.
Let's just play the clip.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, we can do that.
No, here's the deal. The question is, what is the appropriate behavior that they have to engage in international trade with us? And they have to play by the international rules. And what we have done is we have disarmed ourselves. We make up 25% of the world's economy, but we poked our finger in the eye of all of our allies out there.
Wow.
All right. That was exactly like my performance of it, I think. It was
Okay.
Very, very accurate.
So, that it is like the European Union kind of poked the U.S. in the eye.
Well, yeah, like Biden's point has been that he is going to work with European allies to counter the Chinese Communist Party. Look at what our European allies are doing.
Not specifically very interested in countering the Chinese Communist
Doesn't
Party.
seem that way.
With allies like that, who needs enemies?
Amen.
Well, I think that it is a good point, Matt, because I think that for 4 years, essentially, Trump has. I don't think Trump meant to do this, but because he's such a, controversial figure, and he kind of sucks all the air out of a room, or like the media love covering him, love/hate covering him.
Mhm.
So it's always everything is framed in terms of like what Trump is doing or reactions to Trump or whatever. So, seeing that the EU did this, even though it's not going to be Trump, that it's clear that their behavior was not necessarily because they just disliked Trump and that's why they were siding with China.
Yeah.
And I've seen some reactions from people being like, okay, I don't like Trump, but Europe's actions actually make it look like he has a good point about what Europe wants to do and the EU wants to do.
hmm
Right. And I think one of the points, regardless of who's in the U.S. White House, it's like
Matt still thinks Kanye is going to win.
I do.
I just need
Yeah.
to get that out there.
You never know what's going to happen.
Hey, it's not January 6th yet as of recording.
Yes. So basically, like, there's this idea that is often happens in political circles, especially as things get more entrenched and time passes, is that alliances are important for the sake of alliances.
Mm.
And it's like, well, the goal should be to have strong alliances. I would argue that that's not a good goal. The goal is to, like, whatever the goals of your country are, right? To protect jobs, protect your economy, protect national security, and so on. Like, those are the goals. And we want our allies to also be able to achieve their goals on their end, right? Like good conditions for their people and their freedoms and so on, right? So like the goal should be to preserve the things that we want to preserve. And if strong alliances with certain countries help facilitate that, then the alliances are not a goal, but they are certainly a good means to achieve that goal. Whereas if alliances are no longer helping you achieve your goal, then those alliances are bad. And this is why we've seen, like, one of the things about the way Donald Trump has operated is that he's simply like, he doesn't care about alliances per se. He cares about the results of those alliances and whether they help achieve his policy goals, America first and so on. And so what's happened is you see, moving away from European alliances, moving towards Asia alliances, and not because Trump prefers to work with Asians / Australia. It's just that, like, it seems that the Trump administration had seen those alliances as better to help the U.S. achieve its policy goals.
That's a really good point. I mean, it's like a abusive relationship. You don't maintain the relationship because you want to maintain the relationship. You recognize that it's dysfunctional, and then you end it, and then you move into something better.
Well, I think that, the whole multilateralism becomes its own end goal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that the Chinese Communist Party has actually taken advantage of in terms of its propaganda apparatus and how it works with other countries or how it talks to other countries. Because Xi Jinping has been great at using that type of language to make it sound like, China is interested in peaceful development. We're interested in win-win.
Mutual cooperation.
Right. And like
Yeah.
the point is the cooperation.
Right. But cooperation isn't good or bad itself. It depends on what the terms of the cooperation are. So if you are cooperating, but it's on the CCP's terms, that's probably not good.
Well, that's the thing. Like, we have seen how the Chinese Communist Party operates over decades of actual, like, lived practice. Like, we saw how they have
Our lived
violated
experience?
our lived experience, whatever. I'm on a roll, Shelley. Don't interrupt. It's once the rock starts rolling, get out of the way. I'm working on my Biden, folks.
Okay. I
Come
did
on,
not
man.
get that. I did not realize that.
I was not ready for this
But
transition.
sometimes the rock is rolling and then it hits a corn pop.
I
We
think
need
the
a lot
rock
of
is
work.
off the rails right now.
And I had a point, and the point was that, like, look at the WTO. When China joined the World Trade Organization, they have violated every single rule in the World Trade Organization since it began. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, they threw out the agreement it made with the UK over Hong Kong. That international agreement meant nothing to them. As you mentioned, the free trade deal with Australia, that we've seen how this plays out, and how it will play out is the strengthening of the Chinese Communist Party. It will continue to persecute its own people, and it will just make Europe vulnerable to the Chinese Communist Party, which is still hostile.
I do have to say that in terms of the WTO, it's not that the Chinese Communist Party has broken every rule, because they love to enforce the rules when it comes to other countries.
Uh-huh.
So it's it becomes a whole thing where it's like rules for thee, but not for me. So
Yeah. Well, they definitely criticized the Trump's trade war using the WTO structure.
right. Or, when the Obama administration was bringing cases in the WTO towards China for dumping different, I think tires was one of the things and whatever. Of course, those were very unjust. But
Mhm.
on the Chinese Communist Party side, they brought a lot of WTO, rule. They brought cases against the U.S.
Mhm.
So it's fine when you want to use it, but when other people use it against you, then it's not
It's
good.
it's
Yeah.
horrible. Well, again, the same thing is happening in Australia. Australia's saying, hey, what you're doing is violating the WTO rules. And they don't care.
I think also the whole thing about how they're agreeing to these forced labor, or that they are going to work towards,
Yeah, that there was this big breakthrough in forced labor and climate change.
well, one thing that you brought up, Chris, was that, they're not admitting that there is forced labor.
Yeah, just recently, one of the foreign ministry spokesperson said that it's a complete lie that there is forced labor in Xinjiang.
So they could totally agree to continue to work on implementing some kind of, treaty to stop forced labor. But that's not a problem when there's no forced labor.
None at
Right. I
all.
mean, a lot of these Uyghurs are just, they've chosen to live in shared housing and get vocational training with free internships.
That is actually what they're saying. This is not like a
Yeah,
it's
or
not
the-
No, I'm serious.
yeah, it's not a bad joke. This is it is a bad joke, but by the Chinese Communist Party.
So the whole thing is that, it's poverty alleviation. People are just giving the opportunity to go work in factories to,
Yeah.
and they're so grateful for it.
Speaking of, how do you like those Apple products right in front of you?
Well, I mean, if it wasn't Apple, it would be Hewlett Packard or it would be any other company. I think Apple definitely does not have clean hands, but it's not worse necessarily than pretty much any computer that you would buy.
Yeah, it has come out recently that many Apple suppliers have been accused of using forced Uyghur slave labor. And recently, one called Lens, I forget what it's called, Lens Manufacturer. Blah, blah, blah. Anyways, it's a company that designs the glass for iPhones, and it's owned by China's richest woman, and she's been using Uyghur slave labor to make the stuff.
Well, that company doesn't just design the glass for Apple iPhones, though. I think that's the thing that, when we were looking at this, when the Australian Strategic Policy Institute did this whole study on Uyghur slave labor being used in China, they found that a lot of these, manufacturers, they're getting Uyghur slave labor, but they're not just using it for Apple products, or they also, like the front-facing iPhones on some iPhone models, the front-
selfie camera.
the selfie camera is made by a company that has taken Uyghur forced labor, but that company also makes stuff for Samsung phones, and
Yeah.
so it's very hard to get out of the supply chain.
Once you choose to do deals with the Chinese Communist Party, you get your hands dirty.
yeah,
Right.
and I think like it applies to everything. Like I've been trying specifically to not buy things from China.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, well, it was encouraging to me that some clothing manufacturers were moving to Vietnam or different places, India, so I could, see that it was made in India or Vietnam. But I realized that there's an item of clothing that I bought that was made in Vietnam, but I realized that the fabric was made in China. And you can't tell because it tells you where the clothing is made, but not where the components are made.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges with supply chains is now we have a very complicated supply chains. So the company that you buy a product from has, let's say, like 10 different suppliers, but each of those 10 suppliers has 10 suppliers for its thing. And each of them might have 10 for its thing. And actually, it might not be 10, it might be 100, or, Apple probably has over 1,000 suppliers for different things. Eventually, like you're talking about hundreds of thousands potentially of companies involved in the creation of, like, say, this MacBook Pro, right? I mean, like just like even the screws, like who makes the screws that they like,
There's issues with the gold in slave labor in Africa.
right. And so it's so complicated. And the only way to ensure that you don't have anything made in China as part of the supply chain is that the US has to cut off all trade with China. The EU has to cut off all trade with China. The Southeast Asian countries that we buy from have to cut off trade with China. And so, like, the reason we don't have made in North Korea stuff in our supply chain is because every country has cut them off, right?
Except Russia and China.
Yeah, okay, so maybe there's a few things, right? But we don't really know. And I don't think North Korea, because of its small population and small manufacturing base, is a big part of any supply chain. But essentially, it's very, very difficult to get China out of the supply chain. Even if you try, and even when you buy things that are made in America, some components of it
Yeah.
might
You
still be-
guys got me Monopoly Socialism
Oh, right.
for Christmas, and it was like
Yes.
made in America, tokens and dice made in China.
Oh, yeah. I was looking at this thing that was like a scrubbing, like a pot scrubber that was made out of chain mail,
Mhm.
essentially. It was stainless steel rings. And in their whole thing where they're like, where's this made? They're like, it's made in the US. Like, our factories are in the US. However, the only place that we can get this particular kind of stainless steel is in China. So we have to get the steel from China.
Jeez.
Right. And I mean, like 20 years ago, they probably would have been able to get it in the US, assuming that technology existed. But like our steel manufacturing has been hollowed out and it's largely been produced in China.
Yeah.
through steel dumping and subsidies from the Chinese government to
Well,
state
this is
steel
why
manufacturers.
the coronavirus should have been a warning to the world of like, oh, we need to make our own stuff. The United States needs to be making more of its own stuff.
I do think that it was somewhat of a warning, like a wake up call.
Mhm.
We saw this a lot with the PPE, like the protective equipment,
Mm.
because there was literally one company in the U.S. that was making surgical masks, only one, and now I think there are at least two or three that I've personally seen that are making made in the U.S. surgical masks. But the thing with like, oh well, sometimes they couldn't even get the machines to make these masks because the machines had all been sold to China.
And this is part of how, when you make these deals with the Chinese Communist Party, your country sacrifices its national security in a way that maybe isn't readily apparent to the public. Though I will say it is encouraging that there is a lot of public resentment to this agreement in Europe. People don't seem very happy with it. And so there is a question of whether or not it will actually be ratified.
I think there's also some unhappiness from the smaller European countries who felt that Germany kind of just pushed this through.
It was definitely Merkel, like, this is good for our China-vested German industry.
Yeah, I hadn't realized we did a episode like a couple months ago that talked about Germany and China, and I hadn't quite realized how deeply companies like Volkswagen or like their car manufacturers were in China, and that they had gone into China, in the late 70s, early 80s, like as the first Western companies to go into China.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was really fascinating to learn all that stuff.
So let's work with our European allies to counter China.
Right, but Germany is also so dominant in Europe. It's got, giant population, it's got the biggest economy, it's got just this sort of like this power over, the banking and manufacturing and like all these things. And so what Germany does kind of ends up forcing the rest of the European Union to kind of go down that same route. And like, it's one thing for a country like Slovenia to be like, well, we don't want to participate. But it's much harder for them to actually oppose anything. And so essentially Germany gets its way, and that's been the case for a long time. And like, you would think Germany would be like, looking at history, we can see why it's not a good idea to work with brutal authoritarian regimes. And yet they've gone this route working with the CCP. And so it's really quite tragic, especially for Germany, to be the one doing that.
Well, I also think it's interesting in this agreement sort of what happened to Italy, how Italy kind of got sidestepped.
Oh, they were upset because there was some kind of like virtual meeting signing thing involving Xi Jinping and Merkel and Macron are there, but like Italy wasn't invited to be on the call.
Even though when Italy joined the Belt and Road last year, wait, this is 2021 now.
It's 2021.
So 2 years ago. Yeah, I was like, oh, Italy is China's best friend in Europe. No.
Well, I mean, there have been a lot of countries that have been China's best friend in Europe.
That's true. Currently, Italy is being blamed for starting the coronavirus by the Chinese Communist Party.
Partially. It's one of
many countries.
They have several kind of feelers out, and like we'll see which one pans out,
But it's also like it shows how the Chinese Communist Party does things. Italy was a big foothold into Europe. Now that it's been used, whatever, we don't need you anymore. The point is 2021 is looking like there's still going to be lots of stuff for us to cover on China Unscripted and China Uncensored.
I do have to go back to a point about this deal that I forget it was you or Matt who were talking about. Oh, I think it was you, Matt, about like the country losing their national security. That was you, right?
I will take credit for that.
But there's an interesting tweet from the vice president of Taiwan, William Lai Ching-te, who was saying that with signing a trade deal with China, you have to be careful because you only see what you can get. You don't see what you could lose. And what you could lose is, something that's even deeper than slave labor or weaker labor rights or whatever. It's something that goes to the heart of democracy. And that's something that Taiwan had learned.
Wow. So basically getting your trade deal with China is like getting your wish from the monkey's paw.
I think that's what he's saying, that it's basically this idea that, you don't really know what the price you're going to pay for it is.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's definitely a case where like Europe's financial deep state will make a lot of money at the expense of everyone else.
Well, I think it's not just the finance sector.
The elite then.
Mhm.
The deep state elite. This is where we've come to.
Well, I mean, you say deep state, but I think like what that actually is we're talking about, people in Europe's financial industry, manufacturing leaders like Volkswagen and some of these other companies. And it's like in Germany, as in most countries, the corporate leaders end up having a pretty large influence on politics. And so this is what you're referring to as the deep state.
Yeah, forces that are not elected by the people, but still have a incredible amount of say in what happens politically in a country.
Yeah, and I think that is, it's always a risk in any country, whether it's a liberal democracy or not. You end up having these interests play an outsized role in politics, more than is necessary for them to continue sustain business operations. They want to have even more influence to get more,
It's
more
no
gain.
longer capitalism; it's corporatism.
Yeah, so I think that's a big risk, and I think that is what you see at play in Europe now, and it's also what we've seen in the U.S. for a long time. And one of the things that's changed over the last few years is that Washington and Wall Street have kind of butted heads quite a bit, with maybe Treasury Secretary Mnuchin in the middle, trying to like balance out these interests.
Former Goldman Sachs, which is another example of how this all works when you have, top investing financial firms becoming high-ranking politicians after
Yeah.
they retire.
I remember when like a reporter had asked Trump in 2020 something about like, won't your new policy hurt companies like Apple? And Trump is just like, whatever.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, it's funny because of course, like that's a super undiplomatic thing to say, but also like the sentiment there is that the White House is willing to reject corporate interests. And actually there's quite a bit contained in that whatever.
Even there have been Trump supporters that are Wall Street types who have interest in China too, that have been trying to influence the trade deal and different things. So I think it's not necessarily. I think it's a pretty bipartisan problem.
Well, it's definitely, there have been Wall Street types who are pro-Trump, but it's an issue where Republicans and Democrats have both been infiltrated and subverted, and also both sides have actually done a lot of good things. So it's kind of a bipartisan success and failure.
Yeah, there have been some actually great bipartisan successes in 2020. In June, Congress passed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. And then in December, as part of that big, $2.3 trillion omnibus bill, the included was the Taiwan Assurance Act of 2020 and the Tibetan Policy and Support Act. So all three of these were like pretty significant pieces of legislation that are now law, that are, the U.S. standing up in a bipartisan way to the Chinese Communist Party.
And the great thing is that, especially the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, the Trump administration used it this summer to sanction Chinese officials for.
Same with the Hong Kong.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of when we look at, should we have a law or policy, whatever, it's that you've got really at least two pieces of it. So one is the law itself has to be passed because that provides the tools. But the tools don't do any good if they're sitting in a drawer. It's the White House that has to actually use those tools to do the thing that they're designed to do. So in this case, sanctioning specific officials. So the White House is going to put together, or it has this in 2020, put together a list of people to sanction. Right. And so, hopefully this year we'll also see the White House using these tools from the, Taiwan Assurance Act and the Tibet Policy and Support Act to actually take the action that the legislation paves the way for, but does not obligate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
What you're saying is there's a big range in how the president can actually enforce these bills. Like with the Hong Kong thing, Trump could have sanctioned some like no-name official that had no impact.
They didn't have to sanction anybody, actually.
Yeah, it was like a year, right?
Yeah, they had a year to determine whether anybody was sanctionable under the law. And then they had to just, report. Some of it is in the law, like you have to send a report to Congress about certain things, but like whether or not the sanctions are implemented is up to the executive branch. Yeah.
So that's what Matt's saying. It's like Congress provided the tools, but then it was up to the White House to choose how to use that. And fortunately, they were chosen to be very effective at targeting the Chinese Communist Party,
Right.
sanctioned Carrie Lam.
And so also what this means is, from a viewer perspective, if you're, an American watching this, like you got to keep in mind that you need to tell the White House or tell, whichever White House administration official has these tools, like now you got to use them. And, as media, you got to increase the pressure on them to use these tools. And so like we as Americans have to make an effort to get the tools to actually be used. And I think that with some hard work and continued pressure, we can actually achieve that.
I think the ironic thing is this bipartisan consensus in the U.S. about how to treat the Chinese Communist Party is now actually putting us at odds with our European allies, who have a very different take on China relations, as we can see in this bill. And what it makes me really wonder about is what do they plan to do with Huawei, especially Germany, Merkel and Huawei.
Oh, yeah, because this was a big thing that the U.S. did in the last 2 years is they essentially led the rest of the world to start rejecting Huawei, something that looked almost impossible several years ago, that like Huawei was just going to continue its march of domination by providing, all these low-priced telecom equipment to everywhere around the world. And how could you say no if it was, just cheaper to use Huawei? And then the U.S. kind of stepping forward and doing these things, and like the whole Clean Networks initiative that really made a huge difference in getting other countries to step up and say, we're going to join the U.S. initiative, which essentially would ban Huawei and ZTE and other Chinese companies.
Actually, that's a great piece of leadership, is the Clean Networks, right? That's a great way that we've gotten a lot of countries, about a quarter of the countries and many of the most economically dominant ones are all on this Clean Networks thing now.
Contrary to the message of the U.S. has withdrawn from global leadership. This is a good example of the U.S. showing really strong global leadership.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's done really well, and it's also something that's going to continue, I believe, even with a different administration.
Kanye, he means Kanye.
I mean Kanye. Yeah.
Well, so since it's if we have no more to talk about this Europe deal, maybe since it's now the first podcast of 2021, any visions, any resolutions?
Personally, or like things we're looking out for China?
Anything.
We are, in fact, recording this on January 1st, by the way. This
Yeah.
is how we're spending our
Happy
New
New
Year's.
Year. Happy New Year.
Maybe one of my resolutions is to take a vacation at some point. Do you think we might be able to do that at any point soon?
No. One of my resolutions was like, be okay with doing nothing.
This year?
Yeah.
Okay, like as in, if you can't go anywhere, you can't do anything.
Yeah, just to be able to like sit and do nothing for like a short period of, at least a short period of time.
Oh, I thought you meant just.
Let alone a vacation.
Okay, I thought you meant because you remember last year or 2019 we were traveling all the time and like doing all these things. I thought you meant just be okay if we go into lockdown number 4 or whatever.
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, like, can I said, don't always reach for the phone. Don't always do some research. Just take a moment, like sit with my thoughts, look at a tree,
And suddenly realize the yawning abyss inside you, and then
Where's my
quickly.
phone?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's a pretty good one. And for me, in 2019 and the early part of 2020, I was looking at Twitter so much.
Yeah.
And I was tweeting so much. I mean, we had to use it in Hong Kong, I think.
Mhm.
And I was glad because, we're kind of getting
It
information
connected
out
us.
and connected us to a lot of people. But yeah, I think just after I literally started losing my hair in like May, June, just around the time that the national security law was being implemented in Hong Kong, and I was literally waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning because I couldn't sleep, and then looking at Twitter to see all of the terrible things that were happening in Hong Kong. And then I was just like, I have to stop doing this. I'm literally losing my hair. I have to stop doing this. So I've really cut back on Twitter usage in the last few months. And I think I'm a happier person.
How about you, Matt?
I'm gonna make continued and sustained efforts to stop making bad jokes.
Oh,
Uh,
there's a lot to that. And I think that is a great way to end the first podcast of 2020. 2021, Force of Habit. Actually, nothing's going to change. It's all going to be the same.
I do feel like everybody was feeling like 2021, yes, like in a way that when 2019 turned into 2020, no one was like, oh, finally 2020,
Yeah,
right?
it's like you finished your final exam and then you still have like that last week of school, and it's like
Right.
nothing matters.
Well, I mean, 2020, like the real 2020, didn't start till I would argue like late January.
Well, I mean, a lot of stuff happened. Remember the Soleimani thing, the
The
Taiwan election?
Well,
the Iran guy who was killed.
we began
That
our
would be, yeah.
we began our 2020 by traveling to Taiwan to cover the elections, and like there was like as far as we were concerned, there was no such thing as a coronavirus.
No,
the
we-
Taiwan government was like aware of this thing and they were monitoring people, but like
We knew about it. I remember when we left Taiwan, which was January 15th, being a little sketched out about going through the airport because I was like, oh man, this is SARS. Like, this is how SARS happened, that like people were traveling and then,
Mhm.
know.
well, my point was that I was oblivious.
okay. No, because I definitely remember because the report started coming out in early January.
And Taiwan was more
can
involved.
Can I just make the point was that like for most of that first couple weeks of January, the coronavirus wasn't really a thing, right?
Yeah.
And it certainly wasn't part of the international attention. And I would say it didn't really become internationally known until January 22nd when we published our first episode about it on China Uncensored.
Yeah, okay.
We led the way.
And so we've got a couple weeks left maybe of 2020, and then we'll go into 2021, which will
That doesn't make any sense though. Just because
No, I agree, that makes no sense.
just because the coronavirus didn't start being publicly noticed until that doesn't mean that 2021 doesn't start until mid-January.
Yeah. I got to say, though, what's happening with the U.S. election on January 6th, that's got a lot of 2020 energy to it. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should be watching America Uncovered.
Well, good. So now we've promoted China Uncensored and America Uncovered, which is good.
On our channel that has the least number of subs or views.
Yeah. Does anyone here watching this not know about those other shows?
I would find it very weird that somebody would watch China Unscripted but not China Uncensored.
Yeah. That'd be surprising.
Yeah.
But 2021
Maybe-
is full of surprises.
Oh, maybe it's somebody who just listens to podcasts and doesn't use YouTube. That's possible.
That's true. We are on Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify.
And our website, ChinaUnscripted.com.
Is that the website URL? I thought it was not like
Yes.
.tv or something.
I just said the web. That's the website.
We're,
Yes.
Oh,
we're
okay.
good at this, guys.
Once again, we are filming on January 1st in the morning. Great idea.
It wasn't my idea.
It was my idea. You're welcome.
Got to start the new year off right by
That's-
talking
that's right.
about,
All the great things to look forward to. Europe-China trade deal.
I
Yeah.
do think that there are a lot of things to look out for.
Look out for or look forward to?
Look out for.
Damn it.
Sorry. I think that, what is the thing? Be vigilant. Now I'm constant
Prepare
vigilance.
for the worst, but hope for the best.
Well, yeah, I think that it can be really pretty exhausting to pay attention to this because it can be demoralizing sometimes. But I think we're the ones that have to, if nobody pays attention to it, then, it'll just happen. Like all of these, but if there's pushback, then it's just like with the U.S. Clean Networks thing, right?
Mhm.
If the U.S. government had done nothing, then Huawei continues its march across the world. But if you realize what's happening and then you take steps to counter that, like, it's important.
That's a good point, because there is a specific type of propaganda called agitation propaganda that's specifically designed to exhaust people with just all of the agitation. And so like the middle drops out, and then you just have the extremes that fight. And then things get led that way. So yeah, it is important that the middle does not get exhausted by all the fighting and actually still make sure good things happen.
Without context, I think you were describing Twitter.
Well,
Well, what does that say about Twitter? Agitation propaganda.
I do think it's interesting because I have felt the temptation to just drop out.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, we can't totally drop out, but I have felt like a longing to just like buy a farm in the country, not buy the farm, but like
Just a farm.
a farm, and just like
Go down to the country.
yeah, you know, do the whole Chinese scholar thing where you just go into the mountains
Uh-huh.
and write poetry about all of the people in the capital who you hate.
It was an ancient Chinese version of Twitter.
Well, I mean, there were good things that they did too, where they were like, oh, you know, it's time to disengage from like the corruption and, you know, try to find a different way of living or whatever. But
Decouple from the corruption, start clean living. It's good. Go on.
okay.
He, what was,
I'm
what
going to
was the
make
language?
continued and sustained
That's it.
efforts, but it's not enforceable.
I didn't even understand if that was a joke.
You know, because decoupling from the Chinese economy and doing clean networks,
Yeah, the clean,
the-
clean part was real.
it was supposed to be a joke.
Got it.
But again, you cannot enforce my continued and sustained efforts.
The
to stop
problem
this.
is with this, the inspections happen
Yes.
for a wide audience.
Yes. But the Europe-China deal does not require inspections.
That's true.
Okay. Anyway,
Well, okay, my point was that I have felt the temptation to just kind of check out. But if we all do that, then terrible things happen.
Are you saying we're stronger together?
Yes, that is what I'm saying.
that's a nice message.
That's a good message to end this podcast on. So, thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell,
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
and we'll see you next time.